Hey there guys, today we're taking a look at Crysis 2 Remastered running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now we've taken a look at the original Crysis Remastered running on here, and this is Crysis 2. And what you're looking at right now is the game running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution. Now we are running at the stock 15 watt TDP of this chip, and as you can see the performance that we're getting here is pretty brutal. Our FPS average being in the mid-20s with 1% lows in the lower 20s and sometimes even dropping into the high teens isn't exactly the greatest experience for a first-person shooter. Now it is a single-player game here, so it isn't one of those situations where you just need to have the most maximum FPS possible to be competitive, but first-person shooters in particular are pretty rough to play at a below 30 FPS average, and even at 30 FPS they can feel pretty sluggish and heavy to play. So the level of performance that we're getting here is pretty brutal, and also we're at the lowest graphics settings, but there is a lot of texture pop-in that ends up happening. If you look at the models of things all around, you'll see that they'll just be in their lowest possible detail until several seconds pass by, and then they'll finally pop into their regular texture that they're supposed to be at. And this isn't with the texture quality set to the highest or anything like that. We are literally running with the lowest texture quality, and we're still getting some pretty brutal pop-in happening all the time here. So not exactly the most enjoyable experience here. It's going to be pretty rough, and personally I did not find this to be very enjoyable or anything like that to play. It was really rough. We are at the edge of a playable experience though. If we could just get a consistent 30 FPS average, at least you could say that it is playable, though not ideal for a first-person shooter. Of course, we can try to raise the TDP of the chip to see if we can actually boost the performance here. And by doing so, we actually end up seeing more of an uplift in the 1% lows than anything else. Our 1% lows pretty much now end up being at the range where it matches the average that we were getting with just the stock 15 watt TDP, just going up to 25 watts, and we are just slightly under a 30 FPS average most of the time, but after playing for a little while it did end up being at 30 FPS. Still not the most ideal situation, but it definitely feels noticeably better to play like this. And we are at least at the full 1080p resolution, but the texture pop-in is still happening very frequently, and it can be pretty annoying. Crysis is just a franchise that's known for its beautiful graphics, and they still hold up to this day, but not when textures are popping in all the time. When one character can have a very detailed model and suddenly you look at a table and it just looks like it's in Roblox. So not the most ideal situation here either. Of course, we can try to raise the TDP even more, all the way up to 35 watts, to see if that can push us over the edge, because our 1% lows are still underneath 30 FPS, which again for a first-person shooter is not the most ideal situation. This can feel pretty rough, especially in fast-paced situations. If you're someone that's used to playing the Crysis games at a really high speed, this is going to be disorientating. So let's see what 30 watts can actually end up doing for us here. And as most people should reasonably expect, there was no real noticeable uplift going all the way up to 30 watts. We're already at diminishing returns because the GPU clock speed was already at its maximum speed when we were at 25 watts, and the game itself doesn't actually require that much CPU. If you look at the CPU itself, it's not even being utilized at all really. It is just so single-threaded that all those other cores aren't really doing anything, and so the extra TDP really isn't even being used that much. You can see that the power usage that we're at isn't even reaching at 30, and it's just because the game itself doesn't actually need all the way up to 30 watts in this. Certainly if the GPU was able to clock higher, we could probably utilize more of that power, but that's just a hard limit that the CPU, or rather the APU, has, and there's really no going past that. I've already tried messing around with the APU tuning utility to see if I can actually get the GPU to clock higher, and it just can't. It's pretty much hard lock there. So at this point, if we want to boost performance, we're gonna have to start dropping resolution, and we can do that at the full 30 watt TDP to see what is the maximum performance we can actually push out of this. And by dropping down to 900p, we end up in a far better situation than where we were at before. After going through a full run on this same section that we've been doing, the final score ended up being a 1% low of 33 with an FPS average of 42, so we do get a nice bump to everything, and we finally have 1% lows that are consistently above 30 FPS. That means that it does feel noticeably nicer to play. It's not the most ideal situation, but I actually originally played this game on the PlayStation 3, and that was running at 30 FPS, and I managed to play it perfectly fine, though that was with a controller. A controller is far more forgiving with lower FPS than a mouse and keyboard, because you have more control over the input. With a mouse, you feel the lower FPS far more than just using thumbsticks. Now, an easy solution is to just use use a controller while playing this, but I know a lot of people don't like to play first-person shooters with a controller. Ever since I switched to full-time PC gaming, it is very difficult for me to also use a controller with a first-person shooter. It just does not feel right to me. But if you're someone that is coming from using consoles and you're just looking to get into PC gaming, or you're just very flexible with the input device that you can use, then you can have a pretty decent time if you use a controller on here. The FPS is certainly consistent enough that you will find very little to complain about here, but it's definitely not the most ideal situation for a first-person shooter, especially if you're someone that is coming in from consoles that actually would run games at 60 FPS. In particular, if you're a fan of Call of Duty games, because Call of Duty games have pretty much always run on 60 FPS on most generation of consoles where the franchise has been super relevant. Of course, a drop to 720p actually ends up boosting the performance here pretty noticeably as well, and you'll more than likely notice in the footage itself that it just runs significantly smoother. By the end of this run, we actually ended up with an FPS average of 62 with 1% lows of 46. So now we're definitely at a range where things are very playable and very enjoyable here. Now, visually speaking, we are taking a pretty massive hit in terms of the visual quality, but the added smoothness of the whole experience is just really nice. Now, the game itself is pretty massive though, and there will be a lot of situations where the FPS will fluctuate a lot. So I definitely recommend that you play the game at 900p or 720p, especially if you're stuck at a TDP where you really can't go much higher than 15 watts, just because of cooling reasons or just because of the fact that the system that you have is very locked down by the manufacturer. If you can't raise the TDP, then definitely go straight for 720p and see if that feels right for you. At the FPS ranges that you're going to be getting, it really comes down to personal preference and the tolerance that you just have for fluctuating FPS. But with that said, I think 900p is probably the most ideal situation for most people if you care about visual quality. Though the texture pop-in is present at all possible settings, it's just less frequent when you lower the graphics. But it still happens all the time, and it really can be annoying for a game that is supposed to be this visually impressive. So it's definitely something to think about there, and maybe consider playing something else instead, or maybe even playing the original version. But in general, if you want the best experience, you're gonna have to go with 720p, and it does feel noticeably better. And if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of FPS off the top, you can always use the lossless scaling tool with FSR to try to smooth out the overall image quality, since this is a pretty noticeable drop in terms of resolution. But the performance gain is pretty substantial, and it did feel the best to play like this. So anyways, I hope you found this video entertaining or useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe. Check out the Amazon affiliate links down below if you would like to support the channel. It is greatly appreciated, and it is one of the best ways that you can support the channel without having to give any money directly. If you are already looking to buy things on Amazon anyway, just using those links will help me out tremendously. And if you're interested in supporting the channel directly, channel memberships are enabled, and you can join for as little as $1 a month. And supporting the channel directly like that is so immensely appreciated. So I want to thank you so much for that, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.